Welcome all to the feedback for Task E, the December 2023 sitting. I will be taking you through the feedback on Task E. Slide 1, we are looking at the pre-release information to see what was required of the candidate. So in here, it is telling us that we're wanting to expand, and we're looking at this particular expansion opportunity, which is adding additional routes that are underpinned by a wet lease to our existing operations. Now, they tell you that the route that they're looking to introduce is the George O.R. Tambo route, and they've done a bit of preliminary research on it. So you're given the forecasted demand to be high, you're given the potential number of passengers to be 150,000 for the whole year on this particular route. You're then given that the average price is also 1.8, and that they're wanting to make use of the same Airbus, the A320, which is similar to all the Airbuses that they make use of on the other routes. Now they say to you, apply yourself to the potential introduction of this new route, and they're wanting to do it 2 return flights between George and O.R. Tambo. So after really reading this information, you should have gone in to look at the George O.R. Tambo route, the number of passengers that would fly there, the type of airport that's there, what infrastructure is available. But there's a lot that one could have started researching already on this particular route. What came through on the day, the information on the day, we then told that the company is still wanting to make use of the wait list agreement, but now you're given a period which is now 18 months with this option to renew, similar to what you would have seen under Task A. They told us that we are going to be covering some of the particular costs because we are wanting to make use of what is called a wait lease. And then they tell us that on time will cover the cost of the jet fuel, the airport fees, as well as any additional admin and marketing costs that would be incurred relative to the operation of this new route. They then give you the actual amount that we expected to pay for this wait lease, and they tell you that we're going to be paying 12 million exclusive of that per month for these for this 18-month period. And then they tell you that they've prepared some financial projections for a 12-month period, and at this point in time you should have been seeing the difference in your period where you've got an 18-month lease versus a 12-month projection period, and you should have been asking yourself the question around whether it's comparable, I guess, looking at the period of the contract versus the period of the projection. Now they're saying, assume that this commences on 1 January. The next slide, we're then looking at the projections. So some of these numbers have stayed the same, some of the numbers have slightly changed. You then would have noted that your total number of available seats had changed from what was given to you in pre-release, which was 150,000, and now it had become the estimated number of passengers were now 200,448. The total number of seats available being the 250,568, now giving you a load factor of around about 80%. The average price had remained constant in terms of what you had been given on that pre-release information. Now they quantify what this would mean from an income statement perspective for you. They give you the right amount of your ticket revenue alongside any other revenue item, as well as some expenses that would be incurred as part of operating this new route. You see there that there's a positive EBITDA number of 101,739 that is provided to you. And what are they now asking you to do? They say, well, based on this assessment, it looks like we're going to be quite profitable as an on-time, and they seem to be a little bit excited about this opportunity, but then they're asking you for assistance. What is it that they're asking you to do? If we read those 2 points carefully, it says reviewing and commenting on the high-level projections that I have prepared please indicate any assumptions that in your opinion may be unreasonable or which may require further research. And so there's a secondary part. That first part is saying, review and give me your comments on these projections that you're seeing in front of you, and provide a summary of key strategic issues that the board should consider in evaluating the feasibility of the proposed route. So overall, 2 parts to the request that you're being asked to assist with under this task. 1, review and comment on the high-level financial projections. 2, provide a summary of key strategic issues that the board should consider, and that's what you're then told. She concludes basically to say that she hasn't compiled the financial forecast beyond this period, and she's happy to look into that at a later stage. Now, what does the task actually require you to do? The task is straightforward. It says, look at Bridget's email and respond to it regarding those high-level financial projections. Remember, she asked you to review and comment, and provide these key strategic factors that the board, or key strategic issues that you should consider in evaluating the route as a board. Now, what would we have reasonably expected from a candidate in terms of research for this particular task? So looking at the pre-release information, I think I'd already alluded to the type of areas you could have already started researching. Number of airlines that cover the proposed route. Is there any competition on this route? What are the average prices that these airlines are charging that are operating on this route? The traffic on this route, is it like high traffic, or are there lots of people traveling in between? And the average cost of a wet lease, if you had wanted to do, wanted to find out whether those costs would be reasonable. Now, when we assessed the financial projections, so there's 2 parts to this task. This first slide will speak to that first part of the task, which is the financial projections. The next part of the slide will then speak to the second part, which is those key strategic issues. Now, what would we have reasonably expected around the financial projections reviewing and commenting? Again, this is not an exhaustive list of what a candidate could have commented on under the reviewing and commenting on those financial projections, but generally on average, this is what a candidate could have come up with. So thinking about the fact that your income statement is split into revenue and expenses, and maybe any other costs that you see are missing in there, and then I guess holistically questioning the period of that and the type of amounts included in there, but I'm going to go into detail. Now, when we looked at the revenue, you could have gone in to identify that weight. My estimated number of passengers that I was given was 150,000. Now that's changed. Is it actually reasonable to be seeing what I'm seeing? Based on your research, you would have then been able, I guess, to conclude, or looking at the pre-release information, you would have been able to conclude whether those number of passengers make sense, right? So the type of responses that we're not looking for in here is to say, are the estimated number of passengers reasonable? The question then remains relative to what, right? So in order to give a meaningful, I guess, critique of the numbers, or a review and a comment that Bridget could then be able to use, you needed to say why it is that you were questioning the reasonability of the numbers that you would be putting forward to her. So we noted that in some instances, candidates would blindly ask questions around the reasonability of numbers without a valid reason for asking or putting forward the question to Bridget. So I guess that I'm hoping that's becoming or useful or clearer to you. So let me repeat that. So a reasonable reasonability assessment or way of probing that we'd be expecting to see is to say, well, relative to the pre-release information, the 150,000 I was given, do the numbers make sense? Or relative to my research that I've done, does this number make sense? But relative to something, you needed to question the reasonability of the numbers that were being put forward to you, and not just plainly ask, a number of passengers realistic? Is the price okay? A little bit more in terms of that explanation is required. So I'll finish off with those number of passengers, as I think that also spoke to the load factor, because your number of passengers will directly impact the number of that load factor. So you could have questioned it relative to the number of passengers or the load factor. That would have been the same point or the same discussion area that a candidate would be going into. The second part of it is around the ticket price. Now, is to look at whether this ticket price makes sense. You could have looked at it relative to the other airlines. So as part of your research, you would have gone on to go and see, oh, there are other competitors that are flying this route. What kind of prices are they charging? Does my price make sense? Right? But you needed to question the reasonability of this price based on something. So either based on the other airlines or based on research that you had done around the average ticket price. I think I've already hammered enough that questioning the ticket price alone without a valid reason did not allow us to assess you in a manner where the point being raised would have been considered as a valid one. You needed to give us a little bit more in terms of why you thought it was reasonable or why you thought it was not unreasonable as a candidate. Then the other aspect of revenue one could have questioned is the other revenue. Again, relative to your pre-release information, you could have gone on to ask whether these numbers are reasonably making sense. So you could have gone on to see that revenue, your other revenue in your pre-release information as a proportion of revenue represented X amount, and therefore in this particular set of information that you've been given, it now represented Y, and you could have compared the X and the Y to see whether this amount of revenue makes sense. But again, you're questioning the revenue relative to a piece of information that you've obtained, either as part of the pre-release information or as part of your research. So I'm going to close up on the revenue. The secondary aspect that one could have then looked at is on the reasonability of the expenses. There were a number of expenses that had been given to you on that income statement. The very first one there would have been the wet lease amount. Now, if a candidate had done a bit of research into wet leases, they would have found that the industry charges them as using hours, what they call block hours. And in our scenario, it didn't actually really make use of these block hours, and the candidate then could have questioned, I guess, relative to what they had done on research to say, well, you know, does the mechanism that we're using make sense? Is this going to result in a fair amount for us to pay as the company is on time? Then the next expense that was provided was the fuel cost. Now the fuel cost, you would have seen, generally is a very significant part of that income statement. In your pre-release information, the candidate would have been able to assess that, well, generally your fuel costs are in the area of 40%ish, depending on what year you would have taken. You could have come up with a 40% or 46%, and you could have then said, well, on average, it looks like my fuel cost is run about 46% of my expenses. And then when you looked at the set of information that was given to you, you would have found that it only contributes 20%. And then the candidate could have concluded there that, well, this looks to be significantly lower on average than what I would expect for a route. But again, you're probing and you're asking questions about the reasonability of that fuel relative to some information that you've been given. You could have also questioned the reasonability of the fuel, looking at the usage, looking at the price, or thinking about the exchange rates from that perspective. Remember, saying, are the exchange rates reasonable? Are the prices reasonable, or is the fuel usage reasonable? That was not going to earn you the factor or the point, as I would say. You needed to say relative to what? Most of these things. So it's relative to the prices you're seeing as part of your pre-release information or what you're seeing in the market. There you have to have a basis as to why you're asking this question and therefore wanting to say it's reasonable or unreasonable. Commission, landing fees, customer reservation. I'm going to tackle that group as one because you could have used the very same rationale, I guess, to question those. The only information that had been given there was relative to pre-release. So you could have calculated again as a proportion of the cost driver what was a reasonable percentage for that cost, and then compared it to what you've been given. And note the key word there being the cost driver. So you needed to then take a step back and say, well, commission is calculated based either on revenue, that makes sense. So you wouldn't be calculating it as a proportion of your fuel cost or your wet lease, you know. So relative to the correct cost driver, you could have calculated a reasonable percentage for this cost and then compared it to what was given to you on that particular day as an assessment. So landing and parking fees driven by the number of flights, not necessarily the number of passengers, right? So the right cost driver. So it doesn't matter the number of passengers on that plane. It matters the number of flights you're going to have to go and land and park at some of these airports. So the cost driver then was starting to come out a little bit more in these expenses. As you're questioning them, you then almost needed to think a little bit more as to what would be the correct percentage of how of comparison to compare the cost against. Now, after you'd covered the revenue and the expenses that had been given to you in that scenario, you then could have stepped back and said, well, are there any other costs that I'm looking for that are not currently included? Some candidates went on to go note the marketing costs. Some went on to go note some of the setting up costs on that George route. So these costs that were not explicitly given to you, but you're expecting to see as part of this. So again, you're giving a reason to bridge it around why you think what she is putting before the board might not be reasonable or reasonable based on your understanding. There was the issue around the period. I spoke to that as we're going through the information, the fact that your projections are only for 12 months, but you know, if we want to have a fuller assessment of whether it will make sense to get into this wet lease, we need to consider the entire period for this lease, which is actually the 18 months. They mentioned to you that some of the payments were exclusive or inclusive of VAT. And then when you looked into that income statement, you should have then started asking yourself, well, are all these amounts VAT exclusive or VAT inclusive? And the question overall you're asking yourself there is whether they are comparable and whether she's computed that EBITDA number correctly. So I'm hoping that at this point in time, you would have a fairly reasonable picture of what would be valid, I guess, review comments that you could have given to Bridget as part of your response. Now I'll move on to the key strategic issues. Now, as part of the key strategic issues, again, let me say this is not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of some of the most common strategic issues that we found that came across as the candidates were giving some of these responses. Now, as a board, they will want to consider, are there any other alternatives? Is this the only route that we want to go into? Because, you know, there could be other profitable routes that the board could consider that we haven't looked at. And that's simply that consideration there. The next consideration is around the profitability of the proposed route relative to existing routes. We already have existing routes and they are profitable, and we're now wanting to compare the profitability of this new route to the profitability of the existing routes. And the intent there is that, you know, you could just put this flight onto your already existing routes if they are more profitable, because then you would not want to go with the route that is not going to yield the same amount of profitability. You would rather take that aircraft and put it on a route that will give you better profits if that happens to be existing routes. The competitor analysis, I think we spoke to at the beginning, to say the board definitely wants to think about what type of competitors you would have. So they're going into to look at your CFAs, to look at your lifts, so whoever those competitors are in that particular space. So here, if candidates had done great research, they would have noted that a particular airline within South Africa actually operated that route and had also shut down that route. So you would want to be asking the questions as a board. What happened to that particular airline for them to close shop and not be operating this route anymore? But that would have been as a result of some good research as a candidate to have noted. Now the pricing strategy is key, because if you price yourself incorrectly, you're not going to be getting any passengers flying on your particular airline, no matter how well you say their names when they enter your aircraft, but you need to price yourself correctly. So the considerations around, how you will price yourself relative to your competitors was what that consideration was about. The wet lease versus dry lease calculation. So the scenario is only looking at a projection for a wet lease, but it would have been good for the board to also understand how the wet lease would fare up against the dry lease as a number, and therefore have a good understanding from a calculation perspective which of these leases would actually be beneficial to the business. Now, we'd only looked as one side of the coin as part of this analysis, and I guess you'd be advising Bridget to say, maybe we should put both calculations in front of the board so they can see how the one fares up against each other and get into a position where they're able to make the correct decision as a board around whether they should get into this new route. Next one is the NPV. We noted that, if you were wanting to make a longer term decision, the board might actually want to evaluate and make use of an NPV calc for this particular new route rather than an EBITDA calculation, because as we know, the NPV will take into account the time value of money and might yield a more accurate answer around this particular decision. The next point is now around the appropriateness of these fixed lease payments, and the sentiment of this particular point is around the fact that you have fixed lease payments to meet over this period, but the flights to George are seasonal. So the candidate would have done research and noted that George is mostly a touristy, destination place that will have peak prices over holiday seasons, and throughout the year, the passenger demand might not be as great. So your lease payments are standard, and what are you going to do as a company in the months where you don't have as many passengers and you don't earn as much revenue? Will you still have enough to meet those lease payments, or do you actually need to say, during the good months, let me put aside some money so that when some of these bad months come through, I'm actually able to smooth out my profits as a business? So it's the candidate who recognizes that you want to match some of your income to the expense around the lease payments. And there would be a various number of ways to suggest that. The next point is about the impact of the new route on the existing routes. So it's also, as a board, understanding that some of your current customers might have decided to fly down to Cape Town and then drive the Garden Scenic route in order to get to George. And now when you're introducing this particular route, those customers are simply going to choose to fly straight to George, and you might actually, as a result, lose out on passengers on your other existing routes as a result of opening this new route. So it's that effect that candidate would be, expressing to the board and explaining. Next, key strategic issue would be around the reliability and reputation of the wet lease operator. So you will be heavily reliant on this wet lease operator on this particular route. So you're almost wanting to do a bit of research to have an understanding of whether, you know, they're going to be reliable, and, you know, they're gonna lift up on time, because you will be associating your brand and reputation with theirs, and therefore to do that kind of research around them would only make sense as a board before you enter into this agreement. Next point is around the termination of the agreement. So let's say that 8 months or 10 months into this wet lease, we decide that actually we're not making any profits and we'd want to leave. What does the agreement look like? Are there any terms and conditions around for me to exit out of this lease? Sensitivity analysis and scenario planning speaks to, you know, as a board, you need to have a full understanding of your worst case, your best case type of scenario, so that you can assess this decision with the best set of information. So it's now saying, put all of these analysis in place so that you can make a better informed decision. Some candidates there even went in to talk about, as a board, understanding your break-even number of passengers, and then, you know, comparing that to your estimated number of passengers. But most of that is speaking to the sensitivity analysis and the scenario planning aspect. Now, the break-even part we thought would have been very insightful as a candidate, because remember, your proportion of fixed cost is extremely high in this particular scenario. So it would make sense that you want to have an understanding of the number of passengers you would require to break even in order to cover those fixed costs, because they are a significant part of that income statement that you have. And then last but not least is consideration around the board to say, well, do we have sufficient cash resources as a business? I guess we need to be making these lease payments. We might have to incur some kind of setup costs, but do we have sufficient funding to get into this type of business? And then I'm going to go into some feedback that we saw from, I guess, the main marking. And after that, I will take you through some sample scripts that will hopefully assist you to understand what a competent candidate looks like versus a limited competence candidate. So what did we see? We saw that the probing of the load factor and the number of passengers was often done without a reason. So the candidates would question whether it is reasonable to put forward a load factor of 80% or to have X amount of passengers. But remember, it needed to be relative to something for it to have meaning. So to question that load factor, it needed to be relative to something in your pre-release or to some type of research that you had done. So in some cases, we found candidates wanting to put on inflation to the number of passengers and not fully appreciating that this is a new route. Remember, for a new route, you will first need to establish yourself, and you will need to grow that passenger pipeline as you become better and better established, right? So a number of candidates we noted struggle to reasonably comment and review those numbers Bridget had given around the number of passengers and that load factor. Then the probing of expenses. So we found a number of generic responses that would say, is the marketing expense reasonable? Is the wet lease payment reasonable? Is the fuel cost reasonable? Remember, you are speaking to Bridget, and you need to say to her why you're thinking it's not reasonable, right? You must review and comment on this thing. So Bridget, I'm thinking that your costs are not reasonable because when I look at the average fuel cost in the pre-release information, it's 46% and you've got 20%, and therefore I'm wanting to question whether the numbers are reasonable. So the reasonability and this review needed to be coming through relative to something. Now, the strategic considerations were not often well addressed. In some instances, they were very generic and they were not applied to that scenario. I think I took you through the exhaustive list around the strategic issues and what would represent a well-structured response that speaks to the particular scenario that was being given. And now we saw some candidates bringing in the advantages and the disadvantages of the wet lease versus dry lease from task A into this particular scenario. And you know that's not what was requested. It said key strategic factors that you should consider before you get into this route as a board, right? And I've given you the examples before on what those type of factors could look like. Now I will take you into the next, the first script that we'll look at will be a candidate that was graded as a C, to show you what type of response that candidate would have brought forward. Now let us have a look at this candidate's response. So they say, thank you very much for your email regarding the expansion opportunity. I've performed a review of the expansion opportunity and included a summary of the key strategic issues. So already we're starting to get a feel that they're going to cover both aspects of the task, and as a minimum we would have expected that you would cover the expansion opportunity as well as the strategic issues for the board to consider. So let's go in. So the candidate, the very first point is that period issue, where they're noting that, wait, you've prepared your projections for this period of 1 year, which is 12 months, but should we not have considered a different or longer period which aligns to the lease? And they could have gone in to talk about the 18 months or the 3 years, but they're noting the fact that this period that you've used to prepare your projection does not align to the period for that lease payment. The second part is now the part of that NPV, the discounting of this cash flow. This candidate is noting here that, wait, if we're going to be looking at a longer term period, we actually must present value over this period using an appropriate discount rate. But combining those 2 points, we can see that this candidate is appreciating this period issue and the fact that it should be a longer period, which overall should be discounted in order to assess the NPV. Next point that's being raised by the candidate is the issue around the number of flights. They're noting that, wait, if we're operating 2 return flights and these are the number of days we're expecting you to fly 1460, but we're seeing that it's a little bit less, and they're thinking that it's reasonable because, you know, you're taking care of these unforeseen circumstances, e.g. the weather. Maintenance would also have been acceptable, but they're recognizing a bit of downtime in your operations, and therefore the reasonability of why it's below that amount. Estimated number of passengers, the candidate is going in to say, wait, this is quite high at 80% capacity. That 80% alone, remember, cannot fly. They need to give us a reason or a basis as to why they're saying what they're saying. They go on to say, well, relative to the pre-research information you gave me, or the pre-release information, you gave me 150,000, which would have been a load factor of 59%, but now I've got a load factor of 18%. This seems to be unrealistic, or it seems to be a little bit too high. Next thing the candidate is questioning is the price there to say, I've got competitors, I've got other people flying on this route. You know, does this 1.8 make sense? Is it in line with these particular competitors of mine? So again, not just saying, is this 1.8 reasonable, but linking to why you should consider 1.8 and whether it's reasonable or not. And the issue here is the issue around the competitors. So then for the other revenue, the candidate goes in to look at, you budgeted 5% and compares it to the information that was given to them in the pre-release, and they calculate that it was actually 5.93% of revenue, and therefore now it's 5%. You know what? This actually is reasonable. So again, concluding on the reasonability or unreasonability of this revenue amount relative to the pre-release information, not just concluding. The wait lease payment is correctly included. I mean, there's no review, critique, or consideration that's been given there. The next point, though, is insightful, where they say, let's include the variable wet lease payments. We were expecting to actually see them, so these would have come through from Task A. So this candidate starting to bring or integrate the lease under Part A and say, wait, has everything been included from a revenue perspective here? They also now, on that contrast, saying we should also think about the costs associated with that at the end, which is the cost of the removal of that branding. As much as we're including this, we must also think about that, but both coming same style of thinking coming from Task A, and noticing the aspects that were given in there that might not have been incorporated in here. The next part, the candidate is now looking at fuel to say, we've calculated fuel to be too low. You've got 19% relative to what I was given in the pre-release. I had 46%. This doesn't seem to be correct. It's a little bit too low. So not just concluding again, but giving us the numbers to conclude against so that we can get to their thought process of why they say it's too low. The landing and the parking fees, similar type of thinking. So the landing parking fees, the current commission and the customer reservation charges, you'll see that the candidate's gone to look at those pre-release percentages relative to the percentages that we've been given as part of that forecast, and then concluding on the reasonability of that as a result. So at this point, we see that, this candidate has got a well-rounded answer. They addressed, if we think about that slide, a couple of slides back, they've addressed those revenue aspects, they've addressed the expense items, they've taken a step back and they've thought about the completeness of these expenses, is everything being captured on here? And they've also got the period issue around, this 18 months versus the 12 months. So very well thought out, well-rounded answer that's been provided by the candidate so far. Now let's see their strategic issues. They talk about the limited flight experience. So the issue of, we've outsourced our operations. We don't know the type of experience that our customers will receive from this lessor. It says in the information given that we plan to greet our customers on a first name basis. We don't know if they're going to get the experience, and that candidate is noting that. They're talking now to the next part, that it actually could be more costlier to have a wet lease versus a dry lease, and we need to consider all of that and put that into consideration. Then the dependency on the lessor, then it goes on to say, well, we are going to be dependent on this lessor for this particular route, and we must consider it as a board. The last point is on the competitors. So the candidate goes in here to even name the competitors, to say it's not only us flying this route, we've got other competitors, and therefore we must think about how we're going to price ourselves, as the passengers might actually go with a more affordable airline if we have not priced ourselves correctly. But this candidate coming up with some of the key strategic issues that you would have seen in that previous slide and hitting it on the nail. The last point they bring in is around the current demand on the route, which is seems to be 80% based on market research. They're saying, is there actually a demand? This town is a vacation town. In this type of economy, who's going on holiday, right? So they're questioning the demand and based on the downturn in the economy of this particular route, because it's seen more as more of a leisure route, because it's a vacation tourist destination place. But overall, we should have seen that this candidate had good coverage of the financial projections, as well as good coverage of items under the key strategic issues that we would have wanted to see, and therefore overall would have been graded as a competent candidate. Okay, and then let us look at this candidate's attempt as our final slide before we conclude and close off the feedback on task E. They say, we hope well. I've gone through your projections and I've included my comments below. And I'm also going to give you a summary of the key strategic issues the board should consider in assessing the feasibility of this route. So we go on to C. They talk about the estimated number of passengers. And when we get here, they say, that 80% load factor relative to the 70% that was given to us in the pre-release doesn't seem to make sense because it's a new route and they think it might be overly ambitious to be estimating such a high number already on a new route. So this candidate's spot on. They're questioning the load factor relative to something using a reasonable explanation. So here they're questioning that 80% and looking at the fact that, this is a new route and it doesn't seem to be realistic. So we saw a number of candidates here that would have compared the 80 to the 70% and then said, this looks to be reasonable. But remember, your existing routes are well-established routes that this company has been operating for a while, and on such a new route, it actually would not be reasonable for them to take this load factor and even a higher load factor and already be estimating that, right? So the more established routes are coming up with lower load factors, but your new route has got a higher one. That's the kind of critique or commentary we were wanting to see around that load factor. The average price, they're talking about it, but they're not bringing up the amount, and they're just talking now to the fact that we might actually want to lower our prices to attract customers, taking into account the other competitors on this route. So more of a pricing strategy consideration that is coming up from this particular item at the current moment. Then we go on to the ticket revenue. They say, well, the comments on the estimated number of passengers or an average price per ticket goes hand in hand with supporting that the ticket revenue amount seems unreasonable. But what are these comments and what goes hand in hand? The candidates left us now to conclude what we must pick up from the pricing and from the number of passengers in order to support the fact that it's realistic. So do come in and do articulate in your script what it is that you want the person grading to grade you on. So on the other revenue, they then go on to say it's reasonable since it's in line with the forecast of the 2023, and we're not sure at this point in time what they've calculated and what they're comparing it to, and what is the reasoning for concluding that it seems to be in line. If we think of the previous slide and the candidate response that we looked at there, they were very clear to say, well, they've calculated a 5% relative to the revenue, and for our projections, they've calculated another 5.29%, and therefore, looking at these two percentages, it seems to be a reasonable amount. And I'm hoping that we're contrasting and seeing what a insightful response is relative to a response that's seeking to conclude, but we're not necessarily sure what this conclusion is based on. So this candidate, the same pattern and theme emerges where there's a response and they say it's reasonable or unreasonable, but the basis of making that conclusion or statement is not well addressed. Next one is on the wait list. They're saying that it's reasonable, and we are not sure on what the reasonability measure is made on. And in fact, they've gone to say themselves, but wait a minute, I might actually just want to do a little bit more research, but I've already said it's okay and it's reasonable. So yeah. And then on the fuel costs, they're saying, well, the annual flights are the same, so we're flying the same number of flights. So this candidate is not necessarily even thinking about the fact that, it's not about the number of flights. It also matches the route you're taking, the distance of that route. If we're going to be flying 2 hours relative to 1 hour, or the number of kilometers, but there's a distancing issue that they need to think about, not the actual number of flights. Then they go on to say, well, it's much lower compared to the forecast fuel cost, taking into account 1 plane instead of 4 planes that we currently have. So again, not sure what a comparison they're making relative to the forecast. The previous candidate had said 46% relative to the 20%. Some candidates would come out with a random amount and say, 112,000 compared to the 70,000 seems to make sense. But we left understanding how they've formed or how they've gotten to the conclusion of whether they are assessing this to be unreasonable or not, right? So same pattern and theme on the landing and parking fees, where it's reasonable relative to the 2023 landing parking fees, and we're not sure if it's relative to what. So for this candidate, we can see that, they've struggled to articulate the relative to what in their review and commentary. They've come in to give an opinion of whether they think these numbers are reasonable or unreasonable, but we're not sure around whether they've understood why they're saying that and relative to what they're saying that to. Then on the key strategic issues, we go on and they talk about the legal requirements. Remember, legal requirements is vague. We needed to have an understanding of what it is that you mean. And to just, note legal requirements by itself is part of what we describe to be generic, where we're given generic points that are not applied to the scenario for relevance. The competition. Now, the competition, they're saying it's tense in the aviation industry, but they're again not explaining to us that, there's 4 airlines, they're flying there frequently, same routes with us, and it's again, I guess, a bit vague. If we think about the previous candidate, we knew they fully understood the competition that's flying that route. They named us those competitors. They gave us more insightful comments as a board as to say, look at your competitors. You've got these flow guides flying there. Some of these guys are charging X, and that's proper. So this candidate is saying we must consider the competition, which is tense in the aviation industry. But again, it's not looking at that particular route, and they're saying we should consider if there is potential market share in that George route before entering into it. The wet lease. The George route would be operated by means of the wet lease, and we should consider if it would be advantageous if a dry lease can be more profitable. So that one's starting to lean into some of those items that we'd seen in the previous slide around the profitability of the wet lease versus the dry lease, instead of just looking at the one type of lease that we seem to have focused in on this particular question. Next one is on the MOI, and we should consider whether the new routes align with our strategy. Again, starting to feel a bit more generic, where there's nothing in the scenario that seems to suggest that in our MOI we have something that that does not align strategically with this new route that we're wanting to obtain. So raising points that are not necessarily specific or applicable to a scenario, and with not even now bringing in the example as to why we're saying what we're saying, resulted in the key issue not being necessarily considered. The funding. The board should consider if the company has the necessary funds to finance an additional lease, which is a wet lease, if the company will have to obtain a loan or issue more shares in order to finance a new route. So overall, this candidate is coming up with key issues, but struggling to hit home with them in terms of explaining what in this particular scenario makes this a key issue, right? So an issue that's brought about and not explained into the scenario as to why it's a key strategic issue became an issue that was not necessarily key. It is an issue for the board to consider, but here the focus was on the key issues that the board should consider before getting into the route in George. I'm hoping you found the assessments of the scripts useful and you have learned much from this review in terms of how to package and respond to some of the future tasks. And, wishing you the best of luck in your future attempts, and you definitely can do this.